For the record, please state your name and your current address.
My name is Hugo Dachenhausen. I live in Lake Katrina, New York.
In what year did you join the U.S. Navy?
I joined the U.S. Navy in 1951, July 10th.
Were you enlisted or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Were you in the regular Navy or the Navy Reserve?
Regular Navy.
How long did you serve and during what period?
My enlistment tour was for 4 years, 1951 to 1955. I served a total of probably the full enlistment. I got out about 23 days early.
Was it during a time of peace or war?
Well, it was the Korean conflict, which they claimed wasn't a war and it wasn't peace. It was a police action.
When you enlisted, how old were you?
18.
Where were you living when you enlisted?
Well, in the same township that I live in now, the only difference being the name of the town was Ruby instead of Lake Katrina. That's the mailing address.
Did you have any prior experiences at sea?
No.
What family did you leave when you left home for the Navy?
My mother, my father, and my brother.
What were your feelings about leaving?
Well, I don't know. Apprehension probably. A little bit of regret in the sense that just getting out of high school, I don't know, looking for a new experience maybe.
Prior to enlisting, what did you do in civilian life?
I was a high school student.
Were you employed?
You couldn't buy a job for love nor money. Because of the current conflict, you were 18 years old, you were a draft mate. So they wouldn't hire you for nothing. So that was why I joined the Navy.
Were you a Boy Scout?
A long, long time ago.
Did any aspect of scouting help you prepare for the Navy experiences?
None.
When you joined the Navy, what were your first experiences?
Probably being away from home, not knowing anybody. You were thrown into a situation where, well, I know situation's not a good word. It's right now I can't say, but it was an experience that you were looking forward to because every day brought out something new.
Did you go to boot camp?
Yes, sir.
Where?
Bainbridge, Maryland.
What were your first impressions, or what were your impressions of boot camp?
Well, the impressions of boot camp was, again, because of the Korean conflict, Bainbridge was reactivated. Boot camp was a wild place to be because it was being reactivated and we were like the first group that was there. The grass on the grinders was all grown up. There was no windows, there was no panes in the window glass. The floors were warped. In other words, that was again another experience that was thrust upon you to make you overcome it.
Where did you go after boot camp?
I went to Naval Electricians Mate School in Tacoma Park, Maryland.
Okay. Do you want to take a break, or do you? Okay.
Go ahead. I don't need no breaks.
What was the destroyer escort or escort's name which you served on?
USS Loeser, DE-680.
How long did you serve on this ship?
A little over 3 years. March of 52 to June of 55.
What was your first experience with a destroyer escort?
I couldn't find it. And if you want a little background, I was dropped off at the Naval the Convoy Escort Piers, which now is a naval training station in Norfolk. And the ship was tied outboard of the Tidewater being a tender. I couldn't see the 680 because the 680 is so small. And I finally had to find it through asking somebody on the Tidewater, and they took me to the Loeser. I got on board the Loeser, and at that time, the stew burner, which is a cook in the Navy, was standing watch and wanted me to go back on the beach. And I said, thanks, but no thanks. And I went to sleep.
What was your first at-sea experience?
In the early 50s, we had no helicopters, so the DEs were used as plane guard. And plane guard meaning that you operated with a carrier, so in case the pilots had a ditch, you had to pick the pilots up. So you were either port or starboard side of the carrier when they were in flight operations.
Were you a plank owner?
No. I was second crew. And second crew meaning that the ship was put in mothballs after World War II. It was brought out of mothballs, and we were assigned as second crew of the ship.
Where did you go the first time?
The first time? Well, we went on a plane guard detail, which was a 5-day event, which was probably someplace in the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, there was no special place. The first actual place we cruised to was Key West, Florida.
What theaters of duty did the ship sail on?
Excuse me?
What theaters of duty did the ship sail?
Well, we were on what they call the Eastern Seacoast Frontier. In other words, we were basically anti-sub warfare, radar picket, jack of all trades, master of none.
What battle campaigns did the ship participate in when you were on board?
None. No, we were, like I said, we were in during a Korean conflict, and we had luck of the draw. We stayed on the East Coast.
Can you give us a rough idea of other places you sailed and the times involved?
Well, like I say, other than going to Key West, the first time we left, we went what they called Operation Mainbrace. That was when we cruised with the battleship Wisconsin to Europe. We went to, I think we went to Scotland and England. We were with all the NATO ships, and they say all the NATO ships. There were ships from the British, the French, the Italian, all kinds of navies operation under one command of NATO.
Okay. When you first boarded a ship, what was your rating and rate?
I was what they called a fireman apprentice. In other words, it was a striker. A striker being somebody was going to go for a rating, and my rating being I got out of EM school was a striker for electrician's mate.
How did you learn about the shipboard routine?
I had one fellow that I had gone to EM school with that had been there previous to me, and he knew a little more than I did, and then between the two of us, and then after the fact, more people come from the same school. We formed a sort of a camaraderie that one would teach the other. Plus the fact that the ship was manned with reservists that were reactivated, and they wanted to go home. So the more they, or I shouldn't say the more, the faster they taught you, the faster you learned.
Did you spend any time as a mess cook?
Yes.
Did you advance to a higher rate?
Yes, I did.
By what means?
Well, the first rate was given to me as I stepped aboard the quarterdeck. I was made a fireman because of my training in school. 1 year later, I advanced to third-class petty officer, and a year later, I advanced to second-class petty officer.
What shipboard equipment did you operate?
Basically, the ship was electric drive, so the electrician stood what we called a paddle watch. We worked the controls to drive the ship through the water, plus generating the electricity.
Is there anything notable about the equipment?
Yes, there is, because it was very, very quiet, very, very efficient. And after 50 years, they finally realized that the modern ships of today are using the electric drive.
Did it always work?
As far as I know, we had one problem with loss of power, and being we had no emergency generators, it was quite a hairy situation at the particular time, but like everything else, you learn to overcome it.
Was it easy to operate?
Very easy.
Were there any tricks of the trade which made your work easier?
Yes, I mean the basic trick of the trade was, especially an electrician. In other words, there was certain codes you had to go by were color codes. Certain codes you used both hands. Certain times you used what they call, you were a one-armed electrician because of the fact you were working with power, and you wanted to get the electric shocks away from your heart.
Did the equipment have to be cleaned and maintained?
Yes.
Was it easy to maintain?
Basically, yes. The larger equipment was maintained by the art people. We did the routine maintenance of lightning circuits, telephone circuits, warning lights, and that nature.
Besides operating equipment, was your rate also involved in the performance of certain other duties?
Yes, I was on what they called, well, when everybody went aboard, you had what they called a watch quarter and station bill. This told you where you went, what you did, how you did it, in so many words. And I was put on what they called the landing party. And the landing party was in case we encountered some need to go on aboard another vessel, that I was one of the people that were chosen to go.
Did you have a specific responsibility for an area of the ship or a specific compartment?
Not really. I mean, the whole engineering space, as far as the electric went, was the responsibility of all that were involved.
Did you provide support to other crew members and officers?
Yes and no. I mean, the support part was, like I said, we always, being on a small ship versus a larger type ship, the companionship was a lot closer. There was no difference between the deck force, the engineering force, the operation force. In other words, everybody was compatible to everybody else, no matter what your rate was, because it was like being in a household.
What watches and watch sections did you routinely stand?
All right, we had what they called a 3-section watch on the ship when the ship was either in port or underway, and these were staggered 4 on and 8 off when you were steaming. When you're in port, because of the group being so big, you might stand 4 on and 12 off, or 4 on and 16 off, depending on the size. But when you were underway, it was 4 on, 8 off. In other words, every 8 hours you stood a 4-hour watch, and then I think it was probably every 5 days, they used to dog the watch, and then you stood a 2-hour watch from 4 to 8, and then everybody shifted back one. In other words, you changed your time so that you weren't standing the same watch constantly on this, on the length of the tour.
What were your specific duties during the watch?
Throttleman.
How did the watch sections vary based on the readiness condition?
Well, on the readiness condition, everybody was on. In other words, all spaces were manned, where anything that was vital to the electric part of the ship, being the engine rooms itself. You had people in the gyro compass room. You had people on the damage control team. So that no matter what happened or where it happened, there was an electrician available that understood the operational part of the ship.
Did you favor one watch over another?
Yes, I didn't particularly care for what they called the 8 to 12 watch, because 8 to 12 in the evening was when everything was going on. You were stuck in an engine room with a machinist mate staring at the bulkhead.
What hardships did you encounter while standing watch?
Trying to stay awake. And I say stay awake, in other words, you get down into the southern part of the country where it's very, very hot to begin with, and you're down in an engine room where the temperature hovers around 100 degrees all the time. It wants you to really put you to sleep.
Did you do the same basic duties during general quarters, or did your duties change?
No, basically the same.
How long would you remain at general quarters?
It varied. It varied. Most of the time, what they would do is general quarters was basically for the sonar people, because they were sonar students learning how to operate the sonar equipment, and we were released. We went back to our normal routine.
Did you perform general quarters drills often?
I would say it was a routine of probably underway. You would probably do it once or twice. I mean, if you're in port, there was no general quarters called in port, because most of the crew was either on liberty or on leave, so you were just routine maintenance.
How long would it take to man general quarters? Did the time improve the more you drilled?
Sure it did, but it would take anywhere from, well, I can remember one time probably less than a minute. I mean, don't forget now, we're only talking a ship 306 feet long, 38 foot wide, and you only got 100 and some men, and probably 1/3 of them are on watch when general quarters is sounded. So, I mean, you're only talking about probably 60 men moving, and of course, depending on where they are, to get to their battle stations.
What specific general quarters exercises did you get involved with?
Well, like I said, we had sonar, or submarine attack, anti-submarine warfare. We did have one experience with on that Operation Main Brace. They had I don't know what they would call it, but they did have a drill. It was in the middle of the night.
The more you drilled, did the performance improve? What about your confidence level?
I don't really say it improved or it didn't falter any. I mean, because again, you got to be pretty proficient in what you were doing by paying attention to what you were doing.
During the drills, did everything always go as planned?
Not really.
What special sea details were you involved with?
Same again, a throttle watch, a throttleman.
What did you do when the ship moored?
Same thing, throttleman. In other words, you work the throttles.
Did you have an active role during underway, refueling, or replenishment details?
Yes, and was an all-hands event on a small ship like that. No matter what you were or who you were, you either, if you weren't on a watch, you were on the fuel detail, which meant hauling lines to bring the lines across to pump the fuel over, or if you were on a mail delivery or a boatswain's chair delivery, you manned the lines. In other words, you were separated by so many feet between the two ships, and you had to keep the lines either taut or slack depending on which way the ships moved. It was an all-hands deal. In other words, there was nobody was excused from it.
Did you ever ride on a bosun's chair during a ship-to-ship transfer?
No.
Transfer?
No. They call that the Manila Railway.
Okay. Do you want to take a break, get something to drink?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
While on destroyer escorts, who were your COs?
You know, the first CO was a man by the name of Mason, and I don't really remember. All I can remember about the man was that he was a very small individual in stature, and I mean small. In other words, he was basically, to me, didn't look like a captain. In other words, and again, I didn't, at that particular time, being a greenhorn, didn't want to be associated with captains too much. After we went into the Philadelphia Navy Yard, we had a change of command. We got a full commander on, and he was completely different. I say completely different in the sense of he was more congenial, more active, more visible. In other words, he got to know his people. And again, being rank had its privilege, we got a lot of benefits out of it. In other words, when we pulled into any place that we pulled into, because he was a commander, we got Pier Side 2, and Pier Side 2 means just tie right up against the dock, and you just have to walk off the gangway. You don't have to take any boats, any indefinite rights to get to the shore.
Did you ever have any first-hand experiences in officers' country?
Once. I volunteered to go to the Ghost Fleet in Philadelphia, and I had to go up to talk to the executive officer. And I went up and talked to him for about 15 minutes, and because of leading petty officer in the electrician division, I wasn't able to be released, so my request was turned down.
What was your overall impression of the quality of other officers?
Good. I would say I didn't have, in fact, I had an assistant engineering officer that used to ride in my car on weekends. He lived in New Jersey, and I would bring him home in my car. And in other words, once he got outside of the gate, he was just George. He wasn't Mr. George. He was George.
What about your division officers?
Well, like I say, he's the same. He's one and the same. In other words, we're talking a small ship now. I mean, they had, you know, in other words, he was the engineering assistant. The engineering officer was a regular Navy man, and in other words, again, he was looking for his way out. In other words, he was waiting for this assistant to take over his job so that he could go back into civilian life.
Did you observe a contrast between the SEAL's leadership style and the leadership style of the XL?
Not really.
What about your chief or leading petty officer?
Like I said, again, we had such a small group that everybody was almost treated like brothers. In other words, the ratings didn't make any difference. In other words, whether you were a seaman recruit, a fireman recruit, in other words, that's deck and engineering, or whether you were a chief petty officer. In other words, they all were there to help one another.
Did you have any leadership responsibilities?
Yes, on probably my last 6 months or so, when I became leading petty officer of the electricians, because we had nobody. The first class had made chief, and he was basically waiting for transfer, because once you make chief, you're transferred off the ship you're on, where you make you chief. So until they got somebody to replace him, I was in charge, being senior petty officer.
Did you ever have any discipline problems?
No.
Any comments on storms or rough weather?
Yes, we should have got hazardous duty pay because we're under the water more than we're on top. And in 1953, I think it was Hurricane Carol, we rode it out in the York River. And at that particular time, they took everything that could move out of the Norfolk Naval Station. And they put us out into the York River. We put 2 hooks over, and we're still dragging anchor. And that was Hurricane Carol.
How much did your ship roll?
Well, I would say within, and I'm not really going to commit myself, but I would say a good 25 degrees. Because I can remember up in the North Sea, standing a watch, probably a 4-day watch in the morning on a steady steam, which was very easy for the engineers to do. All of a sudden we got a mess of bells, and we were cut speed, we were backing down, we were speeding up. So finally we went back to normal routine. I says to the machinist mate, I said, I'm going to go up and see what's going on. I went up. We were in big ground swells, and ground swells are not what you would consider rough. It's a rolling ocean. In other words, you look out and you see big holes, and then all of a sudden you look out and you see the water coming at you. Well, needless to say, we're in the middle of a fishing fleet because we were off the coast of Denmark. And these guys are out there in little teeny rowboats trying to catch fish. Well, I seen the water coming, and I tried to get to the 01 level, and I never made it. The water caught me up my waist. And I'm saying that's why a 25-degree roll. In other words, that's how much water would come over top of the ship. So needless to say, I got wet. Had to change my clothes before I went back down to the engine room.
Did storms or rough weather affect everyday activities like eating and sleeping?
Yes. When it got rough, the galley was shut down and you were fed sandwiches. And most of the time, when it got rough, they would put you at general quarters so they knew where everybody was.
Did your ship participate with convoy duty?
Not particularly. In other words, we were not a convoy. We were a destroyer squadron. There was 5 ships in the squadron. In other words, we were an anti-submarine warfare group. We traveled with one another on a. It was in a convoy, but not a convoy as what you would consider being a convoy. It was a battle group.
I understand that your ship, the USS Loeser, was involved with anti-submarine exercises at Key West. Would you care to relate your personal experiences during this action?
All right. At the particular time, like I said, the first cruise we made was down to Key West. And we were going down to take out the submarine, the sonar students, because Key West was the location of the sonar school at that particular time for the Navy on the East Coast. And we would go down on a normal operating day. We would pick up so many sonar students. We would go out out to sea, and they would try to look for one of the submarines who had also had sonar students on. So one time you were the hunter, and one time you were the killer. In other words, depending on which way they worked it. And what it was to be is you would go steaming around the water, and the sonar would be listening, When they spotted the submarine, they would fire 2 hedgehogs. And hedgehogs being similar to depth charges, only being smaller, they were filled with green dye. They'd hit the water, they'd turn the water green, the submarine lit up an air bubble. If the air bubble was in a certain distance of them green dyes, the submarine was sunk. Inversely, when they became the hunter or the killer, whichever way you want to look at it, they used to fire torpedoes at us because all the electric companies, General Electric, Western Electric, any one of the ones you could have test piers down there making torpedoes. Well, they fired one at us one day and they didn't set it deep enough. And we got hit in the port side of the ship in one of the fuel tanks. But it was a dud torpedo. In other words, there was no explosives to it. So what they did then was you have what they call collision ship. In other words, something happened, something hit the ship, everybody has to go to a duty station, everybody has to be accounted for, etc., etc. When they surveyed what was wrong, they just proceeded back into port. They had the submarine people come over with their divers and survey the damage.
In 1952, the USS Loeser made a cruise to Europe. Can you relate your experiences during this cruise?
Again, we were, like I say, that was Operation Mainbrace, I believe. Or there was 2 operations. I get them screwed up all the time, but we were traveling again with, I think that was the one with the Wisconsin. And I don't know, it was one night, and we were probably steady steaming, and the electricians had the duty to show the movies. And we used to take the aftermount, had a movie screen painted on the side, we would turn it sideways to show the movie on the mount. Well, probably in the summertime, everybody was out enjoying the evening, enjoying the movie. Don't ask me what the picture was, but all of a sudden, bingo, the star shell went off, fired from the Wisconsin. The Wisconsin probably was a good 15, 18 miles away. They sounded general quarters. Of course, everything went haywire for a few minutes because of being there at the movie. But they sounded general quarters, and everybody gets to general quarters. Now we're going to go attack the Wisconsin. Yeah, we're going to attack the Wisconsin. She's 20 miles away, fired a star shell at us, and we wouldn't even be able to get close to it. But that was a big laugh at that particular night. That here we are, we're a little teeny ship going to fight a battleship. But that was part of your training. In other words, we were again, one was the hunter, one was the killer.
What about meals on board?
I say the meals were fair. Like I say, except when we had rough weather, you had to make do with the rough weather, but basically meals were fair. Towards the end of my enlistment, they instituted a little different format where on Sunday mornings, rather than have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and eat breakfast, they serve what they call brunch from 7 to 1. And then In other words, you could sleep late on Sunday morning. And again, that was your water was put into the cook in the galley, and he served each man individually.
What about the usage of water?
Limited. In other words, we made our own water through taking seawater through an evaporator, removing the salt. But the water was basically to have water for the steam boilers, so we were put on water hours. And water hours being that the showers were only open at certain periods of the day. Otherwise, you had to take what they called a seawater shower. You could take as many seawater showers as you wanted, but fresh water, the showers were open from midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning. So if you wanted a freshwater shower, you had to get up at midnight and take a freshwater shower.
Were there other personal items in short supply?
Fresh milk, fresh vegetables. Mail was not in short supply. I mean, again, depending on if you were in love or not. In other words, if you had a girlfriend, yeah, you missed her because you didn't get mail, but other than that, no.
Any humorous stories involving shipboard life?
Oh, many, many. I mean, the first one, as I spoke in the beginning about the plane guard, I went on with a fellow of mine, a fellow electrician of mine, on that plane guard detail. And like I say, first time out to sea, we all got sick. And I went looking for this individual, and I couldn't find him. And I looked high and low, in, out, up, down, through, anywhere I could find. And I couldn't find him. And I started to get worried because we were out in the Atlantic Ocean, again off the coast of Virginia, maybe even off the New England coast here, on a plane guard detail. And I couldn't find them, and I didn't want to alert anybody or alarm anybody. I said, I'll just keep looking. Well, anyway, one night after supper, I happened to go up on the 01 level where the whaleboat was stored, and I heard a moan. I pulled the canvas up, and there he was, sicker than a dog inside the whaleboat. Well, it relieved me that he couldn't get washed overboard because he was inside the boat. But that was the first funny story. I mean, there was a lot of other ones that we had. I mean, we had, well, we were down in Gitmo Bay. We got on the, like I said, we used to tie up to the pier, but down in Gitmo, there is no piers down there. So we were anchored out, but we got on a Liberty boat for one of the carriers. We got back to the carrier. Everybody got off the boat except us. And the coxswain said, where are you guys going? We said, oh, we're there to the 680. Well, needless to say, he had to take us over to the 680, which was basically against the rules. We could have got in trouble for that, but that was, again, part of being in the Navy, being, like I say, I'm lost for a statement. But in other words, he was mad, but then again he wasn't mad. In other words, he knew that we were riding in little teeny boats where this boat was quite large, more freedom. In other words, he made it easier for us, but we made it harder for him.
Junior sailors on wild goose chases?
Not really.
When you weren't working or standing watch, what pastimes were available?
Well, not too much. I mean, like I said, we had movies every night. There was very little capabilities of having anything recreational because the ship being so small. In port, they did have a softball team. Most of the time, people went over to what we call the Geedunk, which is the original McDonald's. In other words, that was where you got your ice cream, your hamburgers, etc., etc. Also, you got your beer, if you were old enough.
What about holidays at sea?
The only one I can remember at sea was Thanksgiving in Gitmo Bay, Cuba. And other than knowing the fact that it was Thanksgiving and it was supposed to have turkey, which we did have turkey, that was, you know, no real big deal.
What about religious services?
Be honest with you, I really couldn't say that there was any. Like I say, most of the time, the ship being in port, people were at their own volition to go over to either one of the local churches or even one of the bigger ships which had chaplains on for religious services.
Do you have any stories regarding crossing the equator?
Never crossed the equator.
Did you visit any interesting ports of call?
Yeah, excuse me. We went, like I say, 2 cruises across the pond. We went to Christensen, Norway, and then we went from Christensen, Norway to Dublin, Ireland. And again, like I say, we had the commander aboard. When we pulled into Dublin, Ireland, we pulled Pierside 2 across the street from Guinness's brewery. Now, people might wonder why we're bringing Guinness's brewery up, but when you're in the Navy, and you're an 18, 19, or 20-year-old, there's about 3 things that, well, actually there's 4. There's drinking, there's smoking, okay, and there's girls, and the other thing I won't say. But being right across the street from the brewery, everybody was kind of elated. Well, you can't get any closer to that with the ship. Here we are, right here at the brewery. So that was good. The second time we went across, we went to Scotland, and they took us into what they call a firth. The firth being an inland bay off of the ocean. We were about 25 miles from Edinburgh. We went to Edinburgh, looked around there. Scotland was very, very well. I should back up. The time of the year we were there was in the fall of the year, or in fact it was around this time of the year, and it was very, very damp, clammy-like weather. In other words, maybe at a different time it would have been better, but at that particular time, the weather was kind of against us. And then from Scotland we went to Southampton, England, and Southampton, England, we were able to go up into London. We went up and seen all the tourist sites in London. We come back across. I mean, we did local cruises. We went to where we were down in Key West. The port of call down there was Havana, Cuba, because Castro hadn't been in power yet, and it was still a big tourist attraction. We went to New York a couple of times. In fact, we came to New York to take the 20mm mounts off in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They were obsolete, so they got rid of them, and we did that in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We went a couple of cruises in Florida. We went to Fort Lauderdale. We went to Tampa. Oh, I don't know. I don't recall of any other spots, but them were the highlights.
What type of liberty were you given?
Well, most of the time you were let go. Depending on what duty section you were in and what day of the week it was. If you had the duty, you had no liberty. The other liberty was from usually 4:30, which is 16:30, until 7:30 in the morning. There were places where they called Cinderella liberty. being that there was something wrong with the area that you're into, the nature of the people. They had to be back at midnight. If you were in port over a weekend, depending again what duty section you're in, sometimes you got off on Friday afternoon at 16:30 until Monday morning at 7:30. And most of the time, being in Norfolk, everybody left to go home. They used to say there was 10,000 sailors left Norfolk on the weekend.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
I was home quite a bit, quite regular. I was home probably out of the month 2 weekends. So very, very little communication as far as letters went. I did get in trouble once by not writing a letter. I was called up to the engineering officer and told that I better get in contact with my mother because she hadn't heard from me. So I made a phone call because they had put a phone on the ship because we were tied up for maintenance or something. And I called my mother and told her that everything was copacetic, and she was happy. Because when I came home, if I couldn't make it home, I would go to my grandmother's, and they would come and get me, and that would be over a 100-mile round trip to bring me home.
How did you feel when you were finally discharged?
Well, on one hand, I was elated. On the other hand, I didn't really know what was going to come about. I mean, being, again, only 22 years old, where I had basically been taken care of for the previous 4 years. Now I had to come out and face the issue of taking care of myself. I mean, yeah, I could go back home, but after being away for 4 years, you really didn't want to go back home. But then again, that was a safe haven. I considered at one time or another to re-enlist. In fact, I was asked before I got out, which they do all the time, and I turned it down because of the fact that when I mentioned before about going to the Ghost Fleet, I was turned down, and I said, well, now they want to send me to the Ghost Fleet, but I want to go home. So I got out and look forward to being whatever I came out to be. I mean, I'm here today, and I have no regrets.
How do you look back upon your destroyer escort experiences?
I relish them very, very well. I mean, I met a lot of people. I did a lot of things. I learned a lot of things. In fact, to this day, I belong to the association from Loeser. I've been to 8 reunions for them. We've been probably to all parts of the country. I recently joined up this here in Albany. So I keep abreast of it. I mean, I have 2 sons that were in the Navy. My brother's a retired chief in the Navy. So the Navy in our family runs quite deep. So I say I enjoyed my tour in the Navy, on the Loeser, and today, I still think about it.
Thank you for sharing your experiences with future generations. Are there any other comments you would like to add?
None. I mean, like I said, in the beginning, I went and I joined the Navy. The Navy didn't come after me. In other words, I went and joined the Navy. I made the best of what I had, and I did the best I could with what was available. And if I had to do it over again, I would never change my course. In other words, I would be right back there again. In fact, I'm still here. And I hope to be here for a while yet. Okay?
Okay.